Welcome back to the Messy Reformation. My name's Jason Rice, and I'm the lead pastor at Faith Community CRC in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin. My co-host is Willie Cronky. He's a member at Pease CRC in Pease, Minnesota. We're just a couple of guys who love the Christian Reformed Church and want to see Reformation happen in our denomination. But we realize that whenever Reformation happens in the history of the church, things get messy. And things continue to be messy in the Christian Reformed Church. So we're taking the opportunity to have conversations with pastors throughout the Christian Reformed Church to find out what's going on in our denomination, but also to talk about what Reformation might look like. It's also important for you to know that you are our marketing plan. We rely on you to spread the word about what we're doing at the Messy Reformation. We rely on you to share our content. And we rely on you to give us 5-star reviews and give good feedback for our podcast. You are the marketing plan. You can also support us financially on Patreon or Substack. All of the money raised is used to further the mission and the platform of the Messy Reformation. With all that said, we're going to get to this week's episode, which is part 1 of our conversation with Chad Werkhoven. Chad, thanks for coming on. Why don't you just kick us off and tell us a little bit about yourself and your family and the church that you're at?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me, guys. It's good to be here. I'm here in Worthington, Minnesota, which if you look at a map of the state of Minnesota and you want to know where Worthington is, we're way down in the very bottom corner. We're just a couple of miles up from Iowa and a couple of miles over from South Dakota. And I've been here in Worthington for, we're going on 6 years now. So I'm not really a newcomer here anymore. Kind of feels very much at home here. It's been a good place for me and my family.
Awesome. Did you grow up in the Christian Reformed Church, Chad?
I did. I grew up actually in Southern California, which is a bit of a painful reminder on a day like today when I look outside and it's snowing and it's supposed to be negative 17 degrees. But I did grow up in Chino, California, which at the time it still maybe is a little bit, but not like what it was. It was very much a Christian Reformed town. There was 3 or 4 CRC churches, a couple of RCA churches, and we were all centered around the dairy industry back there in the 70s and 80s. And that's where I grew up. And so, I've been part of the Christian Reformed Church my whole life.
Awesome. Did you always kind of expect to be a pastor, or did that come later on in life?
No, not at all. I actually spent most of my adult life building truck equipment. I was in business, and we moved from California up to Washington State way back in the early 90s. A lot of the dairy industry was leaving California at that time or going other places besides the Chino Valley as Los Angeles got bigger, kind of swallowed that whole area up. And we ended up in Washington State, and I went in business with my dad there. And we started off, we had a truck repair shop, and then we would install feed mixers and manure spreaders, that sort of thing on trucks. And then that sort of grew, and we kind of grew out of that, and we started building custom utility trucks for a lot of rural electric associations. And then finally, near the end of our business there, most of what we did was contracting for the federal government. We had an agency that we built a lot of equipment for, and it was fun stuff to build because obviously those guys had a pretty big checkbook. They could just get whatever they wanted to get, and they always had these crazy requests. Could we do this? Could we do this? And I think we could figure that out. And so, we built a lot of neat stuff for them. And I did that all the way up to 2017.
Okay. And so did your call to ministry come then while you were in Washington then?
Yeah. And it wasn't just yesterday, we've been going through the book of Acts and we're in Acts chapter 9, looking at Saul's conversion there, that Damascus Road experience. Certainly that wasn't the case for me, either coming to faith as a whole or stepping into vocational ministry. It was a long glide, I guess you could call it. I started off just out of necessity, teaching Sunday school classes that just happened to be for 7th and 8th graders. For some reason, nobody wants to teach that age of kids. And so I was kind of roped into doing it. And I found out those are the actual best people in the whole church to be teaching, because they're so curious and they desperately want to know what it is that they believe and why we believe it. And so as I would do that more and more, what I found out, instead of going home at night and kind of thinking in my head about the next truck that we were building, or how we could fabricate this, or how we could do that, which, when you're in business, you're always kind of thinking about that kind of stuff. I wasn't thinking about that at home anymore. I was thinking, okay, I've got to teach this class on this topic, or I've got to do the chapel at Christian school. What should I say? And more, that's what I was thinking about. And it just became evident that that's the direction that God was calling me. And we got to a point in our business where, like so many other businesses, you get to this point where you either got to get 5 times bigger to get your scale of economy where it needs to be, or you need to go home. And we had great contracts with the government to continue building things. And that was going well, but I just wasn't into it anymore. And I didn't have the stomach for it, so to speak, to make that sort of investment that it would have taken to continue to do that well. And yeah, God just opened up one door after another for me to go into ministry that way.
Yeah. Have you seen some benefits in the fact that you didn't enter into ministry right away?
Oh, absolutely. Had I done this back in my 20s, I don't think it would have been good for anybody. It wouldn't have been good for me. There's not a congregation out there that it would have been good for then. God certainly knew what he was doing, as he always does, in working things out. I think it is a benefit. That's why, one of my big things that I'm always looking for, and this is, I think, one of our biggest needs moving forward, not just in the Christian Reformed Church, but in churches in general. There's, as these baby boomers retire, there's a huge gap that they're going to leave behind, just numerically, right? The number of open pulpits that there's going to be. We have to find more men who are willing to step up and take congregation. And you do have a better insight, I think. Not to say that everyone who immediately graduated from high school and went to college, and immediately went from college to seminary and immediately into a church somewhere in their mid-20s. Obviously, God has gifted some guys to do that well, for sure. But the most part, I think your head really isn't there to do that well until you're a bit older. At least it wasn't in my case.
Yeah.
That's a really fair point. Now, going kind of from vocation to a different vocation calling, you actually I believe you went to Reformed Theological Seminary, Orlando. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah.
So, tell me a little bit about that experience. Do you find that really enriching, and your kind of year at Calvin, the EPMC? How did that process kind of go for you?
Yeah, actually, that was a long process for me, because as I began at RTS, one of the reasons I ended up at RTS was back in the early 2000s, when I was really starting to get interested in theology. Really wanting to dig into it deeper myself. I'm listening to guys like Sproul and MacArthur, and back in the day, Ravi Zacharias and others like him. And man, it just gets your wheels turning, and I want to know more about that. And for whatever reason, I came across, I know what reason, it was God's doing. But at the time, this was when the internet was in its infancy almost, and RTS came out with what they called the virtual campus. And you could send away and enroll in a course, and they would send you this huge box full of cassette tapes and paper notebook. And you'd listen to the tapes, and you'd fill out the assignments. You'd write your paper and email it in. And for me at the time, it was just a big hobby. I was taking nothing but systematics and philosophy and epistemology related courses. Those are things that I'm fascinated in. And I was just doing it, I guess I'm weird on a lot of levels. That was just fun. And I wasn't really doing it with any sort of career track in mind. I was just doing it because it was fascinating to learn about how God's word applies to all of those different facets. And so that's how I started with RTS. But then as time went on, and especially in the, around 2015, 2016, when I really started to get more serious uh, about this call that God had placed upon me, that's when we started making arrangements to sell our business, and that's when I got more involved with what had evolved into at RTS their hybrid program. And the great blessing of that, and there's so many options like this now, not just from RTS but other seminaries, to where a guy in his 30s or 40s, maybe even 50s, you don't have to uproot your family anymore for 3 or 4 years to go to seminary. You can do this on a hybrid basis now, and we would go to Orlando a couple of times a year. It was always nice to go there in January, to go to Orlando for a couple of weeks. We made up for that by the fact that we also had to go there in July, which was absolutely miserable with the humidity. But it was such a good experience. And so then the rest of the year you were listening to lectures and writing papers and that sort of thing. And then so that was a really neat experience. And then one of the pieces of advice that they had given to us, there was several of us CRC guys at RTS there at the time, and they knew that we had to go through the EPMC program at Calvin Seminary too, and so they were really vigilant about us working in those EPMC classes as we were doing our RTS classes, and they actually swapped some of the electives out so that we didn't have to double dip on those classes. And so as I was finishing things up at RTS, I was also doing EPMC at Calvin Seminary then. So that worked out just so well. Yeah.
That's really great. I didn't know that they did that there and worked. That's something definitely to be keeping in mind.
For sure.
So when you entered the EPMC program, I'm wondering, obviously you had a lot of training in Reformed theology at RTS. When you entered into Calvin, I'm wondering which courses were the most beneficial for you entering into ministry in the Christian Reformed context.
Yeah, it was really interesting learning Reformed theology at RTS because number one, it's an independent seminary. It's not really affiliated with any denomination. That being said, it's very heavily populated by the OPC and PCA, Presbyterian influence there. And so you're learning from these professors who are very Southern. They got the drawl and everything going on, and yet they were educated. A lot of times they were educated in Scotland, so they had that Scottish Presbyterian influence upon them. And yet you're reading through these Dutch guys like Bavinck and Burkhoff and Voss and so you're seeing these guys. I came into RTS thinking that, with a very myopic view of what Reformed theology was, thinking it was just Dutch people of various stripes. And what I found out was, no, we're like the minority in the Reformed world now. And there's this whole other world of people digging into Reformed theology. So you get that perspective at RTS. And so, yeah, you could see a bit of a different slant on things at Calvin. I guess probably one of the best courses just to learn how the system worked was the polity class that we took. There's probably a certain irony in the fact that Kathy Smith was my polity teacher and she taught me how to write overtures. But it was a good class and I appreciated it. And we also got to take creeds and confessions from Calvin Seminary because otherwise the alternative would have been to really dig into the Westminster Divines, which I'm certainly or the Westminster Standards, I should say it. I'm a set of confessions I learned well at RTS and know well, but I'm grateful to be a three forms guy. And so they let us take that creeds and confessions class there at Calvin instead of RTS.
Mm-hmm. And so was Worthington your first call?
Well, so that's another way that God opened the doors. And this is what he does for guys who he's calling. He just makes it happen. And one of the ways he made it happen for me is as we are in the process of selling off our business, which that's a really hard thing to do. It's easy to open a business and it's easy to crash and burn a business, but it's really hard to transition out of one and do that well. And so as I was doing that, then there was an opening in our home church there in Sunnyside, Washington, and where I could become a commissioned pastor, which was fantastic because it gave me some experience in the church there then. I was able to I had still one hand on our business, ramping that down. I'm still finishing up seminary at the time, and then was able to kind of get my feet wet in actual day-to-day church life there in Sunnyside. And so, we were in a good spot there in Sunnyside. That's where we raised our kids. We have 4 girls, my wife and I, and my family, still parts of my family, my folks live in Sunnyside there yet. And we were in no hurry to go anywhere. And we started, to think about it, that day was going to come, that the Lord would call us somewhere else. And so Linda and I, my wife, we kind of made a list of what it was that we wanted in a community. And by the time we got done with this list, I said to Linda, it's going to be a while before we see an opening come through that meets all of these criteria. And then I think it was like 2 or 3 weeks later, we were sitting on an airplane flying out to Minnesota to come see Worthington because this was exactly what we were looking for. And they had some ups and downs in their search process. I think they were 2.5 or 3 years in. So again, God's timing was there. And yeah, by the end of that summer, here we were in southern Minnesota.
Yeah. What were some of the things that you guys were looking for?
The Minnesota Vikings.
Well, part of there's no lie in that because as a preacher, we preach twice a week here. That's a lot of sermons, and the Vikings and the Twins are like this ever-giving source of sermon illustrations because both of those teams, they do so well, right? And they perform so good, but they can never close the deal. They can never get it done. And so I've got like this ongoing treasure trove of sermon illustrations. Just, so that was part of it maybe. But no, I've always been drawn to, I love agriculture. Always been part of agriculture in one way, shape, or form. I love small towns. What we like about Worthington, though, is Worthington has about 14,000 people. So I don't know if that's a small, for some people, that's a huge city. For others, that's not very big at all. It's right where we like to be. It's small enough that you kind of know everybody around town, but it's not so small that everybody really knows everybody, like what some of the surrounding towns here tend to be. And so one of the things that we liked about Worthington is back in the 90s, the late mid-90s, here in Worthington, they struggled. They're like so many Midwestern agricultural towns, their identity is changing, and they didn't quite know how to grow into that, didn't know what to do with that. And then they struggled in a lot of different ways. Since then, they've figured a lot of things out. They've figured out what it takes to rebuild their identity. And this is a terrific place to live. There's so much going on here in this little town. We have a big, beautiful lake right in the middle of town. That's huge. And they've really capitalized well on that here in Worthington. And so it's just a great place to be.
I know you guys have some really cool ministry things going on there. Why don't you tell us about some of the cool things happening in your church?
Well, I don't know that what we have going on here in our church is any cooler than anybody else. In fact, it'd probably be a stretch to say that we make our focus to be not cool, but what I mean by that is we're not trying to be innovative here. Yeah. We're very, very focused on what it means to be a church that really exercises the means of grace, the ordinary means of grace well. So that means we really focus on gathered worship, corporate worship, and the preached word. That's our primary focus. That's what everything is pointing toward. And that's been going well here in Worthington. One of the things that I knew coming in to this community and to this church in particular is it's not a huge church. We have 50 or 60 families. It's about a medium-sized church. But in the years prior to my coming here, they lost 4 or 5 of their pillar family. I mean, not just the wallflower people who are kind of off in the distance and you're sorry to see them go, but you don't really miss them. I mean, these were the people who were financing a lot of what was going on here, who were making things happen. And for one reason or another, they all moved somewhere else. And so what was neat about that was that now in these intervening years, a lot of these guys are stepping into those roles and taking on that leadership and making things happen here. And that's been fun to be part of and to see how the word that gets preached here on the Lord's Day energizes people and then they're out there doing things. So that's really neat to see.
Yeah. Yeah, that's cool. Let's help our listeners understand when you say, everything that you guys are doing are kind of driving toward that gathered worship and the preached word and the administration of the sacraments. What does that look like, that everything's kind of driving toward that one point?
Well, what that looks like is we're very conscientious here of having too many activities for people. Some churches are so program driven. There's something going on every night, and that keeps people so busy that they just don't have time to focus in on how God's word is settling into them as they're hearing it proclaimed. So we don't have a whole lot of weekly activities going on here. We have cadets and gems, and those are huge programs here, and God is blessing them in big ways. Another thing that makes us probably really different is we don't have any committees, and that's quite intentional. When I came here, I looked through the file cabinet here that's sitting next to me that's full of minutes from committees going way back into the 90s. And what was going on here in Worthington was the same that was going on in Sunnyside where we were, and the same in probably 500 other churches like ours. Just all of these gears are turning, but nothing's happening. And so I came in and looked at that, and he said, we're just going to stop them all, and we'll see what we miss, and then we'll do what we need to do. And what's happened here in 5 years now is that we really didn't miss much of it. And it's not that those things aren't being done anymore. That's what I love to see, is people they feel empowered now. They see something that it would be good for the church to do this. So they don't have to go to a committee and ask anymore, and they don't have to have a council liaison who's spending all of his time going to committee meetings. We don't spend our council meetings talking about all of this minutia anymore. It just gets done. People just go out and do it. And wow, the things that they're doing here, it just amazed me. And it's really starting to get traction now. And even like building and grounds type of stuff. Somebody sees a need here, something, a door is getting looser, needs some paint or whatever the case, they just do it. And there's no committee to get in the way. And all of that, again, is I don't want people so busy here that they don't have time to actually grow in God's word. And it's been going well.
Yeah, I remember being really convicted about that early when I was in youth ministry with Willie. I remember reading Eugene Peterson, and he made a comment. This isn't a direct quote, but he made a comment along the lines of, churches love programs and activities because it makes them feel like they're doing things and accomplishing things. But often they're not accomplishing anything. And so it becomes some pseudo comfort. And so a church has an outreach committee that does zero outreach, but the church pats themselves on the back and goes, well, we have an outreach committee, or we've got this program going on and it's actually doing nothing, but we pat ourselves on the back and think, oh, we're doing something. And so, I've been trying to help people understand that for a long time as well, that there actually is a real beauty in not having all of these programs and not keeping everybody so busy for both of the reasons. For the reasons that you were mentioning, it frees people up to just kind of follow the Lord's leading, but also it removes all of the false metrics that we're using on whether a church is successful or not as well.
Yeah, one of the things I'm the most proud of is the wrong way to say it. Maybe proud of as an under shepherd of the Lord who's actually doing these things would be the better way to put it. But it's easy often when you see a church growing in their faith. Oftentimes, at least it's been my experience that it's easier to see this happening in the women of the congregation than what it is in the men. As men, there's lots of reasons for that, which we don't need to explore right now. But they keep that a little bit closer to the chest if they're growing at all, and oftentimes they're not growing. What I'm seeing here is like right now, our Sunday school classes, all of the classes, even down to the little kids right now, are taught by men. And we've got wonderful women teachers here. I'm not saying that that it ought to be men, but just the fact that men are willing to sit down with these little kids, and more now, they're extracting themselves from curriculum. What they're doing is just sitting down and reading these Bible stories with the kids and answering the questions that the kids have along the way and pointing this out there and pointing that out there. Right now, our cadet program is just booming, and there's nothing better than to just walk through the hallways here while cadets is going on GEMS too, and look in these classrooms and see a bunch of little heads down with nothing on the table but open Bibles, and these men and women in the GEMS just leading these kids through God's word. We had, in December, a lot of churches, that's when you elect your new councilman. And so we just went through that here a couple of months ago, and we had a full slate of candidates, all of them who were eager to be on that, to be considered, to be nominated. A lot of churches, man, it's like pulling teeth to get a guy to stand for council. We had a full slate, and then we had 2 or 3 others, guys who would have liked to have been considered, but for whatever reason it wasn't their year or whatever, and maybe next year, and so that's good to see that these men are really digging into here what it means to be a church man, to not just show up and not just write a check and not just be on this committee, but to actually dig in and disciple those around them. And that's exciting to see.
That is exciting. That's really exciting. Yeah. And I really think it's good too. I've often said this, Willie and I have talked about one of the probably biggest blessings in our youth ministry is when our church stripped us of our budget because we immediately stopped using any kind of curriculum and just started preaching through the Bible because we're like, oh, well, the word is free. We could just start working through that. And I realize how much better it is than using curriculum, because often curriculums in and of itself is only as good as the person teaching it. So you can have the best curriculum in the world and a terrible person teaching it, it'll be terrible. And you can have terrible curriculum and you can have the best teacher in the world and it'll be good. And so if you just take curriculum out of the mix and just say, why don't you just start working through a book of the Bible and, or like you said, the stories of the Bible or whatever, there's your curriculum and you just start walking through it and everybody has questions about those things. And then you start answering those questions. It's so basic. We've tried to make this so complicated and it's really just basic stuff that we need to be doing in our churches. Yeah.
I mean, there's this new, maybe not new for a lot of us, but for some, a new interest in really digging into our confessions. And that's good to see, isn't it? And I don't know how many times somebody has asked me, well, do you have a good curriculum that you could share on teaching the Heidelberg Catechism or the Belgic Confession? And I always, I do my best to just patiently answer their question, but that's exactly what the Catechism is. It is its own curriculum. It's a teaching aid. Just sit down, open it up with the Catechism in one hand, your Bible in the other. All of those footnotes will tell you where to turn. And just start talking through it with people, with 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 people, and man, it's amazing what's in those things and how it is that it channels our growth.
Well, and like we're saying, and what Jason's kind of saying, it is basically there, and I would say it's ordinary, and that's what it's supposed to be. That's why we call these things the ordinary means of grace that God has given to His church, that are at our disposal every single Lord's Day. And again, you're talking about people who are passionately equipped to do these things. Just to some of the best teachers and mentors that I've ever had are people that not just knew the materials they were teaching me, but they really loved them. And when you really love something, you can impart it and communicate it in a much more meaningful way. So I think, and another thing we need to realize is it's so ordinary, but that's exactly where God has promised, first and foremost, to work. My word will never return void, and I will accomplish all my purpose. I think if we just rest in those promises, then we won't need any problems coming up with a manufactured curriculum that doesn't work anyway.
Yeah, as I think I mentioned before, right now in our morning services, we're going through the book of Acts. And one thing that we've been noticing and going through, we're up to chapter 9 now, and the emphasis that Luke puts on what it was that was growing that early church. It was the proclamation of God's word. Because there's all of these other things that are going on around them, the miracles that were happening, and things that would have been so impressive on one hand to kind of see, and boy, I wish I could have been part of that, you think. But then you look at the attention that Luke gives to what's going on, and the only reason that he mentions, oh yeah, Peter and John healed this guy, the only reason that he doesn't tell you anything about the guy, doesn't really even tell you what happened or what happened to the guy later on in life. It's just, he just needed that for the setup for the sermon that Peter gave after the healing. And it's all about the preached word. That's what was growing the church then. That's what continues to grow the church now.
Yeah. I was just struck by this in my devotions as well, going through Acts and coming to one of my favorite passages in Acts is Acts 20, where Paul's giving his kind of final words to the Ephesian elders. And even as you read through that and you think, okay, this is Paul's final words and how he's describing his ministry, it's all in the realm of teaching. Even at the beginning, he says, you know how I lived among you, serving the Lord with all humility and tears and trials. And then he says, how I did not shrink from declaring to you anything that was profitable and teaching you in public and from house to house. Even there, he's framing his entire ministry as being a word-based ministry where he was teaching people in public from house to house. It was very, very discipleship focused. And I keep thinking back to this moment at Synod, not the infamous moment from Synod 2022, but at Synod 2023, when we were debating this Scott Vanderplug's motion on the floor of Synod. And you had got up and spoke to the motion in favor of the motion, and you had made a comment about how we need to be focusing on the means of grace in the midst of this, because this is how we grow a church. But I remember looking around at faces after you said that, and I thought, most people are like, what the heck is he talking about? This is not, Scott Vanderplug's motion is about evangelism. That's not about the means of grace. And you could see like it really confused people because so many people have gone down the wrong train in understanding how you grow a church.
Yeah. I guess for me, and the way that the Lord has kind of brought me into vocational ministry, again, it was through the teaching of 7th and 8th graders. And one of, again, for the first couple of years that I did it, it was an absolute train wreck. I had no idea what I was doing. And I'm grasping for any sort of curriculum I can find at that point in time, just that desperation of, okay, I went from the best thing about the start of church on a Sunday morning was it was going to be, that was the longest point in the week before I had to go back into a room with those kids again. Right. And just hating not hating, that's too strong of a word, but frustration of not knowing how it was that what was I going to tell these kids again the next Sunday? And over time, I discovered the Belgic Confession. this thing that was sitting, what's that up there on the shelf? I really didn't know anything about it myself. And I started going through it and just started reading it with the kids. And they're absolutely fascinated by it. And it answers these 4 questions that we all have to answer. Who is God? Who are we? How are we saved? How should we live? And so in doing that, I came across Article 29 of the Confession, where it talks about how it is that you identify a true church. And we've talked about this verbatim, or just so often, right? That it's the preaching of the word, the celebration of the sacraments, and the maintenance of discipline. But what's so cool about 29 then is it says, okay, when the church does those things well, you're going to just organically produce these Christians who have the true marks of being a Christian, right? They're growing in the word. They're serving and loving their neighbors without turning to the right and to the left. The one creates the other.
That's all we have for this week. If you want to help us out and support the Messy Reformation, another thing you can do is sign up for our newsletter through Substack. That way you'll get episodes and summaries sent directly into your email inbox. It also gives us the ability to communicate with our audience, which is one of the biggest struggles of a podcast. So head over to the Messy Reformation on Substack and sign up for our newsletter. But until then, don't forget this is Christ's church, and he bought it with his blood. And we've been warned that wolves will come in trying to destroy the flock. So keep a close watch on your life and on your doctrine. Preach the word in season and out of season, and keep fighting the good fight in this messy Reformation.